Some people do not break into your life with noise. They seep in, quiet as dust, through an open window, settling in places you thought were already cleaned. And before you recognize the weight of them, you are already adjusting your breathing to make space for their storms. There is a kind of wisdom that does not argue. It does not raise its voice or beg to be understood. It simply sees. It sees the pattern behind the apology, the repetition behind the promise, the familiar cycle that never learns how to end. And in that seeing, something inside you begins to shift, not in bitterness, but in clarity. Because the smartest way to deal with what drains you is not to wrestle with it until you are exhausted. It is to recognize that not everything deserves access to you. Not every voice deserves an echo inside your mind. Not every presence deserves a seat at the table of your peace. There comes a moment when you understand that distance is not absence of love, but presence of self-respect. That stepping back is not retreat, but return to yourself, to your silence, to the parts of you that were never meant to be consumed by chaos. And in that return, you begin to see clearly. Peace was never something you had to fight for in others. It was something you were always meant to protect within yourself. Toxic people rarely announce themselves with obvious disruption. They do not always arrive as chaos or conflict that can be easily recognized and resisted. More often, they come in softly, wrapped in familiarity, charm, shared history, or even kindness that feels genuine at first glance. They listen well. They speak gently. They offer just enough understanding to make you believe they are safe. And because of that softness, you do not question their presence. You make space for them without realizing you are making room for something that will slowly begin to take more than it gives. At the beginning, there is usually nothing that feels dangerous. In fact, it can feel comforting. They may agree with you too easily, mirror your thoughts, or present themselves as someone who finally understands you in a way others have not. This sense of recognition creates trust, and trust creates openness. In that openness, boundaries begin to blur. You share more, explain more, give more of your time, your attention, your emotional energy, and still nothing seems wrong. Because harm rarely begins in a way that demands immediate attention. The subtlety is what makes it difficult. Toxicity does not always appear as insult or attack. Sometimes it appears as dependency, as constant need, as emotional weight that shifts slowly onto your shoulders. You start noticing that conversations leave you slightly more tired than before, that your peace feels a little less steady after interactions. But because there is no single dramatic moment to point to, you dismiss the feeling. You tell yourself you are overthinking, that everyone has flaws, that patience is part of understanding people. What makes this even more complex is how these individuals often alternate between warmth and withdrawal. One moment they are kind, supportive, even affirming. The next they are distant, critical, or emotionally unavailable. This inconsistency creates confusion, and confusion keeps you engaged. You begin trying to solve the pattern, to restore the initial version of them you first encountered, believing that if you communicate better, give more grace, or stay more patient, things will return to what they seem to be. But the truth is that what you saw in the beginning was not the full picture. And introductions are designed to open doors, not reveal entire rooms. Over time, the repetition of subtle discomforts begins to form a clearer image, but by then emotional investment has already deepened. You find yourself explaining away behavior that once would have felt unacceptable because acceptance has been slowly redefined through exposure. This is how the soft arrival becomes the hardest to leave. Not because the harm is immediate, but because it is gradual. It arrives in small permissions, quiet compromises, slight adjustments to your instincts, and by the time you recognize that something is off, you are already entangled in the habit of accommodating it, already questioning whether your perception is accurate, already standing at the edge of realization that what entered gently has been reshaping your internal landscape all along. The smartest response to toxic people is not built on reaction, but on recognition. It begins with the ability to see clearly, even when emotions try to blur the edges of reality. Many people remain trapped not because they cannot leave, but because they keep negotiating with patterns that have already shown themselves. They hold on to words instead of behavior, intentions instead of repetition, and hope instead of evidence. Clarity, however, asks for something different. It asks you to trust what is consistent over what is occasional, what is proven over what is promised. When someone repeatedly shows you who they are through their actions, their disregard, their inconsistency, or their emotional manipulation, the mind often resists acceptance. There is a natural desire to believe in potential, to give space for change, to interpret moments of kindness as signs of growth. But clarity does not confuse isolated good moments with a stable character. It understands that anyone can be kind once, but only a pattern reveals truth. And so the smartest way to deal with toxic people is to stop rewriting their identity based on their best moments and start reading it based on their repeated ones. This kind of clarity requires emotional discipline. It requires stepping back from the immediate pull of apology, explanation, or temporary softness. Toxic dynamics often survive because they keep you engaged in interpretation. You are constantly decoding behavior, trying to assign meaning to contradictions, trying to reconcile warmth with harm. But clarity interrupts this cycle. It removes the need to solve people and replaces it with the responsibility to observe them. There is also a quiet strength in choosing not to argue with what is already evident. Many people waste energy trying to make others understand their impact, as if awareness will automatically lead to change. But understanding is not always the issue. Some people are fully aware of their behavior and still repeat it. In such cases, explaining yourself becomes a form of self-drain because you are speaking to a version of the situation that does not exist. Clarity, instead, shifts your focus from being understood to understanding what is happening. This shift changes everything. It allows you to stop measuring your worth through someone else's treatment of you. It stops you from bending your instincts to accommodate inconsistency. It helps you recognize that confusion is not a sign of complexity, but often a sign of misalignment. Where there is peace, there is clarity. Where there is constant emotional disturbance, there is usually a pattern that is being ignored. The smartest response, then, is quiet observation. Not confrontation that seeks validation, not debate that seeks resolution, but the steady act of seeing without distortion. When you begin to trust what is repeatedly revealed, rather than what is occasionally displayed, you step out of illusion and into awareness. And in that awareness, your decisions become less about managing others and more about protecting your own emotional space, your own stability, your own sense of self that no longer depends on interpreting what should already be understood. Emotional distance is often misunderstood because people confuse it with coldness, rejection, or a lack of care. In reality, it is none of these things. It is a deliberate act of self-preservation, shaped not by anger, but by experience. It is what happens when someone learns, sometimes painfully, that closeness without boundaries becomes a place where they slowly disappear. Emotional distance is not the absence of feeling. It is the decision to stop allowing every feeling to dictate access to you. There are moments in life when staying emotionally open to the wrong people becomes costly. You begin to notice that every interaction leaves residue, that certain conversations linger in your thoughts longer than they should, that your inner calm becomes dependent on someone else's mood or behavior. In such situations, distance becomes not just an option, but a necessity. It is the space where you reclaim your internal balance, where your thoughts are no longer constantly shaped by someone else's instability. Choosing emotional distance does not mean you stop caring about others entirely. It means you stop carrying what was never yours to carry. It is the understanding that empathy without limits turns into exhaustion, and availability without boundaries turns into depletion. When you are emotionally too close to toxic patterns, you begin to normalize them. You start adjusting your reactions, lowering your standards, and explaining away behavior that once would have disturbed your peace. Distance interrupts this slow erosion. What makes emotional distance powerful is that it creates perspective. When you are no longer entangled in constant emotional exchange, you begin to see things as they are rather than as they feel in the moment. The urgency fades. The confusion softens. You are able to observe behavior without immediately absorbing its weight. This space allows truth to surface more clearly without the interference of emotional dependency. Many people resist distance because they associate it with guilt. They believe that stepping back makes them unkind or disloyal. But kindness that destroys your inner stability is not true kindness. It is self-abandonment. Emotional distance corrects this imbalance. It allows you to remain respectful without remaining accessible in ways that harm you. It draws a line between compassion and consumption, between understanding someone and being consumed by their cycles. There is also strength in not reacting immediately to everything. Emotional distance teaches restraint. It gives you the ability to pause before responding, to reflect before engaging, to choose silence when words would only deepen confusion. In that pause, you regain authority over your emotional world. You are no longer pulled into every storm someone else creates. Instead, you observe it from a place where it cannot easily reach you. Over time, this practice reshapes your relationships. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop overextending your energy. You begin to notice who respects your space, and who only values your availability. And in that awareness, your life becomes less reactive and more intentional. You are no longer defined by the emotional demands placed upon you, but by the boundaries you maintain in silence, allowing your peace to exist without negotiation or apology. Not everyone deserves a detailed explanation of your boundary, and learning this is often one of the most freeing realizations a person can have. There is a tendency, especially among those who value fairness and understanding, to believe that if they can just explain themselves clearly enough, others will eventually respect their limits. But this belief assumes good faith on the other side. It assumes that misunderstanding is the problem, when in reality, some people do not misunderstand your boundaries. They simply disagree with them because your limits interrupt what they benefit from. When you start setting boundaries, you often begin with explanation. You try to make others see your perspective, to understand your emotional needs, to recognize why certain behaviors are no longer acceptable. At first, this feels reasonable. Communication seems like the bridge to respect. But over time, you begin to notice a pattern. The more you explain, the more you are questioned. The more you justify, the more your limits are debated. Instead of your boundary being accepted as a simple statement of self-respect, it becomes a topic of negotiation, as if your comfort requires approval from others. This is where emotional fatigue begins. You find yourself repeating the same reasoning in different forms, trying to make your boundaries sound more logical, more acceptable, more difficult to challenge. But boundaries do not become valid through explanation. They become valid through enforcement. A boundary is not a request for agreement. It is a declaration of what you will no longer participate in. And declarations do not require constant defense. The truth is, people who are committed to misunderstanding, you will always find a way to reinterpret your words. No explanation will ever be sufficient for someone invested in crossing your limits. This is why over-explaining often weakens your position instead of strengthening it. It shifts your energy from protection to persuasion. Instead of standing firm in your decision, you begin to justify it. And in that justification, the boundary itself becomes blurred. There is a quiet strength in saying less and meaning it completely. When your boundaries are clear in your actions, they do not need repeated verbal reinforcement. Consistency becomes your language. You stop arguing with those who challenge your limits and start responding with distance, silence, or withdrawal when necessary. This shift is not about being harsh. It is about being final in your self-respect. Not explaining your boundaries to those who repeatedly cross them is also a form of emotional maturity. It reflects the understanding that your peace is not up for debate. You are no longer seeking validation for your discomfort. You are no longer trying to convince others that your limits are reasonable. Instead, you recognize that anyone who values your presence will also respect the conditions under which that presence is given. This realization changes how you engage with people. You begin to conserve your energy for those who listen the first time, who adjust without argument, who respect without resistance. And for those who do not, you stop offering endless explanations that only drain you further. In that silence, your boundaries become stronger than words ever could, because they are no longer dependent on being understood to be honored. They simply exist as part of how you choose to protect your own emotional space and self-respect. Peace is not something you extract from other people by correcting their behavior or convincing them to become gentler versions of themselves. It is something you build by learning where not to stand in relation to them. Many people spend years attempting to reshape toxic individuals, believing that patience, explanation, or emotional endurance will eventually transform what consistently harms them into something safe. This creates a cycle where energy is constantly directed outward, trying to fix, adjust, or soften someone else's patterns, while one's own inner stability slowly erodes. The assumption behind this effort is that if someone truly understands the pain they cause, they will naturally change. But this assumes that awareness always leads to accountability, which is not always the case. In reality, some people are fully aware of their impact and continue their behavior because the dynamic benefits them, even if it costs others their peace. The smartest shift is realizing that peace does not require resolution with such individuals, but distance from the cycle they create. Choosing not to orbit toxic people means refusing to make them the center of emotional attention, analysis, or reaction. Even when they attempt to pull you back through guilt, memory, or familiarity, it is a withdrawal of attention, not necessarily a dramatic exit, but a gradual removal of emotional investment that once fed the connection. When you stop orbiting them, you stop reacting to every shift in their mood, every inconsistency, every invitation to re-enter confusion. This does not come from hatred, but from clarity that your energy is not meant to be spent managing instability that does not belong to you. Over time, this creates space where your thoughts are no longer occupied by their patterns, and your emotional state is no longer dependent on their behavior. In that space, something subtle begins to form, a steadier sense of self that is not constantly negotiating its peace with external turbulence. Many people mistake disengagement for loss, but what is actually lost is the habit of self-abandonment that came with over-involvement. When you are no longer orbiting, you begin to see the relationship from a distance that reveals its structure more honestly than participation ever allowed. You notice how much of your emotional energy was previously spent interpreting, reacting, and adjusting, and how little of it was reserved for yourself. This awareness is not painful in the way conflict is painful. It is sobering because it shows how much of your internal world was outsourced to external unpredictability. Peace then becomes less about fixing the outer environment and more about refusing to remain in systems that continuously disrupt your inner one. And once that refusal becomes consistent, attention shifts inward toward rebuilding rhythm, silence, and emotional steadiness without needing anyone else to cooperate with it. And as this shift deepens, the mind begins to recognize how differently it feels to move through days without constantly tracking someone else's instability. Noticing how attention once scattered outward now starts to return in quieter ways that begin to reshape